Thanks. Thanks very much for the kind invitation to speak here. I think it's no secret that some of us would have wished for some more diversity with respect to the lineup of keynote speakers here as regards gender balance, but I think we've had a very varied program with respect to topics, and I'll try to contribute to that by saying something just about agency and not about free will. I am picking up on a question that is in the general description of the conference, namely, does the existence of probabilistic processes or of probabilistic laws of nature make free actions possible? The way I've been following discussions today so far, it seems to me that some speakers here are using free actions as more or less synonymous with free will. I will make a distinction between free actions and free will, and I will limit myself to talking about free actions only. The main reason for that is that I don't know what free will is or could be. I think it's a very difficult issue and tangled up with lots of things that we don't properly understand, and agency, I think, is something that is a bit more tractable. So what I want to sell to you is the answer yes to the question on this slide. That is, free agency is compatible with indeterminism. That's what I want to defend. And the method I will use is to give an explicit model in which at least, some steps towards free agency are recognizable in a model that is thoroughly indeterministic at the base level. That provides, as I would like to suggest, a how possibly account for free agency under indeterminism. There is no pretension on my side that this has got anything to do with how free action is actually possible in this world. I'll be silent about that. And as I said, I won't address free will. I will also not address incompatibilism. So to situate my claim, here is a table that I guess most of you are familiar with from the general discussion of the issues of free will and determinism. The question in this debate is mostly about whether free will is compatible or not compatible with the metaphysical doctrine of determinism. That is the compatibilist and incompatibilist position with regards to the free will debate, as it's commonly called. And now, if determinism is true, we have two proper labels for the resulting positions in the free will debate, namely soft determinism for the claim that free will is compatible with determinism and determinism is true, and hard determinism for the position that free will is not compatible with determinism while determinism is true, which means that free will cannot be real. Right? We have no proper labels for the positions with respect to the falsity of determinism. Some people on the compatibilist side defend a kind of agnosticism with respect to determinism. So maybe the compatibilist position in the case of the falsity of determinism amounts to some kind of agnosticism. And there is also the venerable position of libertarianism, which is a position that buys into the incompatibility of free will with determinism, but has some additional features, namely the truth of indeterminism, the falsity of determinism, and also the actual existence of free will, and that is a package deal that I think makes this position dialectically very hard to defend. So I'm not going to defend a libertarianist position here, not even with respect to agency. I think a fair representation of the space of options with respect to compatibility and incompatibility options should look like this, where we treat determinism and indeterminism symmetrically. There are two questions. One is the existence of free agency, agents and their actions, compatible with determinism? And there is the other question, is it compatible with indeterminism? Those questions are logically independent. So all four positions can be held. Of course, the mere compatibility of free agency with one of the metaphysical options does not amount to the reality of free agency. This is really just about a logical compatibility. And with respect to this symmetrical space of options, the position I want to defend is just that the existence of agents and actions is compatible with indeterminism. And this may entail, if this existence of free agency is also compatible with determinism, that no matter what the metaphysical truth about determinism is, agency is possible, or it may entail, given incompatibilism traditionally conceived, that we can have agency, free agency, only under indeterminism. I'm going to be silent about that. I'm not going to defend, to repeat, an incompatibilist stance here. So what I want to do is to introduce to you briefly my main concepts with which I want to work. I want to delineate agency from free will in a structure of certain causal powers. So I will have a threefold distinction of causal powers where agency takes the middle rung, as it were. After I've told you a bit about that and shown two cute pictures of cats, I will go on to lay out some claims about indeterminism, but I will not defend indeterminism very strictly. So I will just make a suggestion that it's our best guess in many respects that indeterminism holds of the world as a metaphysical thesis, but I will not need this for my main topic, which is to defend the compatibility of agency and indeterminism. So then I'll introduce a model that I've been working on with a physicist colleague of mine. Actually, this whole talk is part of a broader project that I'm undergoing with Hans Briegel of the University of Innsbruck, a quantum physicist who was director of the Quantum Optics Institute at Innsbruck for 10 years and who has collaborated on issues of agency in Konstanz and at Innsbruck. So I'm going to present a model that Hans Briegel has developed based on some physical motivations about random processes in quantum optics. And I will show you in which way I think this model can be read as making a few steps towards modeling agency. Then, since I am defending a position whereby something in the direction of free will, at least free agency, is claimed to be compatible with indeterminism, I will run up against the challenge from luck, which we've briefly seen in Professor von Bachter's talk, whereby the problem seems to be if something is due to chance, it can't be due to anybody, so it can't be attributed, so it can't be free agency or it can't be free will. And I will address this challenge with respect to the details of the model that I will have laid out, and that will end my talk. Okay, so how to get at a proper notion of agency? I am going to address this question, which is a question of philosophical explication in an indirect way. Namely, I want to tell you or remind you that we use certain causal attributions of various strength, or various, to use Michael Thompson's terminology, various conceptual gears. Right? We can say that something is due to something, an event is due to an object, a happening is due to something. We can gear this attribution in three ways at least. We can use causal attribution, saying merely that a certain object is causally involved in the production of an event. We can attribute agency, which I take to be more than mere causal attribution, and we can use our human interaction of moral attribution. And I want to draw some distinctions between these three types of attribution. I'm doing this because I want to get at a notion of agency that is, as I said, less than free will. I guess about free will we only know from the human perspective, and it may be that free will is confined to human beings. I don't know so much about dolphins, but maybe it's only us that has free will with all its morally loaded implications that I'm going to leave to the side. So I want to make room for animals. I also want to make room at least for future artifacts, at least conceptually. Right? So, and as I said, this ordering I take to be inclusive. So if I attribute a happening to another human being in a moral way, so I say you hurt me or my rights or in doing this, then I also say you were agentive in doing this, and I also say you contributed causally to bringing about this, right? But I can stop at some rung of the attribution ladder. And of course we know about all these types of attributions from ourselves, from our human interaction, but that's also very complex, and a lot of issues come in that are best left to the side when trying to clarify the concepts. So I'll talk about cats for a moment, right? And I think with cats we can make a very nice case for distinguishing the mere causal attribution from the agency attribution. So suppose your cat sheds hair on your carpet, right? Then you attribute, so who was that? You know, why is that carpet strewn with this, with these hairs? And they will say it was the cat. It's due to the cat did it. But the cat did it in a causal sense. Whereas if the cat claws your sofa and destroys your sofa, you will use a different kind of attribution. You will also say, who was that? It was the cat. But you will use a different, stronger type of attribution. I think you should not, and you don't, except metaphorically, I guess, attribute anything to a cat in a moral sense. I don't think you can blame a cat morally for example, killing a bird. You may blame the owner of the cat for not taking proper care of the cat such that it kills birds, but I don't think the cat is, you know, a proper object of moral attribution. But agency attribution is okay, and I think this shows when we look at what we do when the cat does these things. So, if the cat sheds hair on your carpet, you treat the cat as a physical cause of the hair on the carpet, and you may alter the cat physically to remove that causal role it has played, right, if that annoys you. So you may vacuum the cat or put on a cat sweater or maybe change the cat's diet, right, such that it leads to less shedding. But you do not, I hope, and it's strongly advised against if you look it up in the literature, you do not try to train the cat to refrain from shedding. You can train the cat not to go where her shedding will annoy you, that's okay, but you can train the cat to alter her physiology such that she will not shed hair. Right? That's just out of the question. Whereas if the cat claws your sofa, you can train the cat. You can interact with the cat, for example, in the way shown to the right, in such a way that the cat will further on refrain from clawing your sofa. It may be more or less successful. This is cats. Cats are difficult. But you can train an agent. So the difficulty, the difference in attribution, I think, becomes clear here. There is causal attribution and there is agency attribution. And agency attribution is more, and the more shows, for example, in the possibility of training, of learning. Now, if you buy this for the cat, you should also buy it for human beings. I think that I want sometimes to be treated merely as an agent, not as a moral being. Here I want to be treated as a moral being. I want you to be kind to me, I want to be kind to you, I want to be fair to you, and I want you to be fair to me in discussion. But sometimes I don't want to be in the moral realm at all. When I go to swim training, let's say, to swimming class, I want my trainer to give me feedback on the way I perform as a mere agent. Right? I just want to, like the cat, I want to be trained to become better at some capacity that I may have or that I may still lack. So sometimes agency attribution is the appropriate thing in the human realm, sometimes it's not, and with cats it stops at agency attribution. So I said most of this. Causal attribution can pertain to any physical object whatsoever, and there an object can cause an event either because it was caused to cause that event or maybe spontaneously. Agency attribution, I said, has to do with learning, with training, and moral attribution has to do with interpersonal attitudes. In the free will debate, I will mention this only briefly. When Strawson, for example, looks at excuses and kinds of retracting from the moral stance, which he observes we sometimes do in interaction with other human beings, he mixes the merely causal attribution and the merely agentive attribution. So he says that when we put on the objective attitude, as he calls it, we may sometimes treat an agent as something to be handled or cured or trained, which would be the agency attribution, like with the cat. Okay, so now I've always used the word agency, but in my title I have free agency. Not in the title, but in the quote that I took from the conference program. So what about agency and free agency? I want to be brief. First, let's say I want to be a realist about these kinds of attributions that I just told you. Right? I want to convince you that it's sometimes proper to attribute causation, to attribute agency, or to morally attribute an event to someone. I think we all do this. This is our common practice. And I think we have no reason for skepticism with regard to these ways of attributing. So there are lots of agents around. We, of course, are agents. Cats are agents. Lizards, crows, squid. I'm not so sure further down the biological ladder, as it were. Maybe some spiders. If you've read Helen Stewart's book on Metaphysics for Agency, she makes the case that certain spiders are certainly in the agency field. That may be proper. It's maybe up to biologists to find out more about this. Somewhere on the biological scale, agency attribution will not be proper anymore. I think bacteria do not act in the sense that they can be trained in the way I've shown you with the cat. Trees, certainly not, I guess. But this is all up for empirical investigation. Now we sometimes speak of agency as free or unfree. For example, politically or socially, we can say, this person is under a tick or something, so she's not free in doing what she's doing. I think all these qualifications of agency as free or unfree rest on a certain metaphysical conception of agency as always free. So I see free in free agency as merely explicative. Maybe we can talk about this in discussion. So free agency is tied to persisting entities, agents, that are also causally effective. And I think we can talk about agency, and that's the big difference to free will. We can talk about this without invoking consciousness, without invoking a strong notion of the will, without presupposing that these beings have a language, and without talking about ethics. I think ethics is not for cats, but agency applies to cats. Now, I want to sell you a certain agency model, right? I need to tell you what that model should exhibit. So what are the traits of agency that you need to see in a model to believe that this could be a model of agency? And of course that's difficult. So Helen Stewart, again in her book, has a certain list of features that she thinks an agent has to exhibit for the agency concept to properly apply. I have my different list, but I think it's a plausible list, so I'll just give it to you and we can talk about it later. So first of all, why is the thermostat that regulates the room temperature here not an agent? The thermostat that regulates the room temperature here is causally effective. It behaves in a certain way in certain circumstances. It causes changes, right? But it's not an agent, and I think it's not an agent specifically because its behavior is so rigid, right? It's like, and we sometimes are merely causally efficacious. So when I blink because an object comes close to my eye, I exhibit a behavior that is reflex-like, that I can't help, that I can train myself not to perform. right? So there, this is not agency. If it's rigid, it's not agency. So agency has to be non-rigid. And I want to draw your attention to something that I think is missed in the debate about free will, but also in the debate about agency, namely that we want this non-rigidity, the flexibility of agency, we want to see this on two different time scales. We want an agent both to be flexible on a short time scale, right? So we want the agent to be able to overcome an obstacle, for example. So if you see the robot, the robot runs against the wall, and then goes back, and runs against the wall again. And if it does that all the time, I would say this is inflexible. This is not, we can train such a being. That being has too little behavioral repertoire. So we want some flexibility at the short time scale in a given situation, but we also want flexibility on a longer time scale, adaptivity. We want the agent to be an object for training. We want an agent to be able to learn certain things, to adapt to its environment. Right? And that is the most difficult part to spell out. We want, I think, the action to make sense for the agent, right? What an agent does is to be something for that agent. And that is difficult to spell out. But some minimal notions of reasons, interests, preferences, aims, or a good for the agent, I think, have to be present in order for proper agency attribution to get going. And that may be something that can help us, find the rung at the biological ladder, as it were, at which agency attribution makes proper sense. Okay, so much for agency. Now, very briefly, to determinism and indeterminism. Michael, of course, knew that we were going to disagree, so let's disagree a bit. I think I agree with you about, determinism being a virtue of physical theories. And I also think, in line with what Gerd Keil said in his question, that the determinism and indeterminism that interests us in the agency or even free will debate is the universal determinism, a general metaphysical thesis about the way the world is like. And of course we may be able to glean, some ideas about the truth or falsity of that thesis from physics, but it's unclear how that exactly goes. I would agree with that there's no clear path. But I think we can spell out what universal determinism means very clearly and briefly and without reference to physical laws. And there I guess I disagree with many other people. But I think universal determinism just says that at each moment there's exactly one real possibility for the future to evolve. And note that in this statement I'm not talking about states of affairs, states of the universe, physical laws. Because I don't think we need them. I don't think we have a proper grasp on what laws of nature are, and we've seen this in some of the talks here, that there's lots of disagreement. I think we don't need to come to agreement on what a state of the universe would be, which is, a mess, because you need to be talking about intrinsic properties and maximally intrinsic and all over space-time and so on and so forth. And it gets very complicated and even technically very hard to get a grip on. I don't think we need this. I think all we need is, at each moment, just one real possibility. Then you have determinism. That means that indeterminism is very easy to have, right? Because it just means at some moments more than one real possibility. And so this is really different from the Laplacian determinism that is mostly invoked when people talk about determinism, indeterminism, with reference to some discussions in philosophy of science, right? And of course, but I guess I don't need to say a lot about this in this audience. There is talk about determination, for example, in neuroscience, where determination just means probabilistic difference making. And that is not what is at issue in the question of agency or free will under determinism, because everyone agrees that influences make a difference to what people do. I think that is just common sense. So determination is not the issue, it's really universal determinism. Okay, now just a brief defense of indeterminism, and I know I can't do justice to the complexity of the issue. I think indeterminism is the dialectical starting point with respect to our everyday arsenal of concepts. I think that most of the things we do unreflectively, just assumes indeterminism to be true. Determinism is a highly refined philosophical concept that may be hard to, that may have difficulty surviving outside the philosophical discussion, I think. So everyday assumptions are just, of course things can go differently. You can give this an epistemic reading as a trained philosopher and say, look, all we mean is that we don't know. But this is the second step. I think our initial position is really that there's really different options for you to have tea or coffee tomorrow. And I don't think we need to be moved away from that position, and I don't see any good arguments moving us away from that position. Now there is another inroad, which maybe we need determinism to do science. As I said, I agree with Michael that it's a good thing for a scientific theory to be deterministic, because we can use it in a certain way in which we can't use an indeterministic theory. But I don't think that we need to presuppose determinism to do science. I think, on the contrary, to view yourself as doing experimental science, I actually think you need an assumption of indeterministic possibilities for intervention on the course of nature. But that is certainly debatable. Now, we have very simple physical systems that exhibit, to the best of our knowledge, indeterminism, and of course there's disagreement again, because you can interpret what these systems do in various ways. But I think the simplest and best understood way of talking about, for example, a beam splitter in quantum optics, where a photon goes in and can go out in one of two ways, is that there's just no fact of the matter when the photon goes in where it will end up. And then one of the two things happens, and that's all you can say. Note that, and this is my third step, as it were, in defending indeterminism, note that we use a lot of indeterminism for technology. So I've seen this number in a talk at a quantum randomness conference, that our current technology relies on 10 to the 14 bits of randomness per day. This is a lot. This has increased billionfold over the last few decades. And the better that randomness is, the more secure our communications, our computers and so forth are. And the best we can do nowadays, and this sells, so people buy it, right, is to use quantum indeterminism. So I have no shares in this company. This is just it's just one of the various companies that sell quantum indeterminism devices. Right? You can get your random bits from quantum mechanical hardware. And in the US, the National Institute of Standards is building a quantum randomness beacon that, when it's fully implemented, will give you certified randomness for use, for example, in business contracts. So one of the ideas is, for example, I buy 1,000 light bulbs from you, right? And we make a contract, and I want those light bulbs to be functional. So I want to sample them. I want you to give me 3 of those light bulbs. And if all those 3 light bulbs are okay, I will buy you a lot of 1,000. If one of them malfunctions, I will not buy the lot. Now, how do I select the 3 light bulbs, right? You can, of course, select those light bulbs for me, known to be working, and sell me your bad lot of light bulbs. But we can agree on the NIST randomness beacon on the day of arrival of the lot of light bulbs, to select those 3 for us. And none of us can know which light bulbs will be selected. And this is considered to be a fair way of doing such a business contract. And this all ultimately relies on quantum randomness. As I said, the case is not closed, but there are good reasons to stick with indeterminism. So, what about agency under indeterminism? And the method I'm going to use is one where I'm trying to make a positive case for the possibility of agency, free agency, under indeterminism. I think that for the incompatibility arguments, you need to do some philosophical heavy lifting, right? So if you want to prove that there can be no free agency under determinism, this will be very difficult philosophically. But with respect to the positive cases, to the compatibility cases, all you need to show is one example where both concepts are exhibited, and that's what I'm trying. And I know I'm not going to fully succeed because the model is much too simple, but I will show you some steps towards fleshing this out. So we do a lot of modeling in the sciences, and such models can provide how possibility explanations for the existence of certain phenomena. For example, ferromagnetism, we know, is a complex emergent behavior of certain materials. And we have some grip on ferromagnetism because we have some kind of model for ferromagnetism. Agency is also, I think, an emergent causal power. So it's not something to be explained very simply by, just putting together certain things. So what would an agency model look like? And here now I appeal to the model of projective simulation that Hans Briegel has developed in a series of papers starting in 2012. And that is a model that is being investigated in his group and in several other groups, which uses a certain machine learning paradigm. And there are various instances of the model, and I'm only going to show you a simple case. So normally if you talk about artificial agents, the concepts you're using are, you have an agent and its environment. The agent has certain sensors taking information in and certain actuators effecting changes in the environment, and the agent runs an agency program. And that's our general, computational scheme of the mind applied to agency. And in the projective simulation model, so this is normally deterministic. In the projective simulation model, we replace the agent program by a stochastic memory process, by a stochastic memory organization that allows for the crucial aspect of learning in agency. So what is in the blue box here is something that Briegel has called episodic and compositional memory. The idea being that an agent has evolved, through her history to have a certain state of memory in which there are certain episodes, lived episodes or maybe imagined episodes, stored that can be triggered through an associative process. And in this network of clips, you would have, in the simplest version of the network, you would have some percept triggering the activation of some of one of these stored episodes, and then probabilistic hopping through the network until in the end an actuator is triggered such that there is some physical change to the environment. Right? So that is one run, as it were, of the agency recipe. So this network changes through the agent's development by reinforcement learning. So if an agent does something that is successful, then certain connections in the network will be strengthened, and if the agent does something that is not successful, then these connections will decay over time. The agent will forget that they were useful. And this structure, that's the important point, is fundamentally indeterministic. Right? These kinds of models are employed in physics, random walks in various for the explanation of various phenomena, initially Brownian motion, for example, early 20th century by Einstein. So such networks are well known, and the hope is that through the learning scheme that is added, this becomes a model for agency. I'll hop over some applications of the model. This is maybe interesting. So one of the applications of the model has been in robotics. There's a certain group at Innsbruck that trains a robot to pick up a book, which is surprisingly difficult for robots, because books need to be put up in very precise ways. You need to put up a book by the binding, and so you need to reorient it such that you can put it up, and you need to slide your finger underneath. We do this very simply, but a robot has a hard time, and so this robotic scheme was trained using the projective simulation network. So, this is the agency model, right? Very simple. So there is a certain associative memory structure. Through perception, one of those memory clips, as they're called, is triggered. Then activation hops along probabilistically through the network, triggers some output. The result is fed back into the network, thereby training the network. Nodes can be added to the network depending on what incarnation of the model you're looking at. And then the network can be trained to perform certain tasks. Right? And now the question is, can this be agency? Right? Can the agency attribution really make sense, given that we have here a random process? Right? We specify the model such that we know it's really a random process at bottom. And the question is, does this make sense? Right? Can we really attribute? So there's the challenge from luck. The challenge from luck comes in many guises, and you can try a challenge from luck already against causal attribution. Right? You can say a certain object cannot cause a certain event unless that cause was a necessitating cause. Right? So we saw the quote from Hobbes in von Löffler's talk. But I think we've come to disagree with that, and we accept probabilistic causation. Right? I think important steps on the way were, for example, Feynman's bomb. So if the bomb goes off indeterministically and blows a building to pieces, we would still say the bomb caused the building to collapse, even though that was a case of probabilistic causation. But agency attribution may be more problematic. There's various forms of various bad arguments, I think, that are too quick. But let me give you van Inwagen's story, which is phrased with respect to free will. Van Inwagen considers an agent, Alice, who has two choices. She can do the morally good thing or the morally bad thing, right? And in fact, she does the good thing, and we praise her. But now van Inwagen says, let's assume that what Alice did was indeterministic. So it was not at the time, at some time before the choice, there was the possibility that she would do the other thing. And now let's repeat this maybe 100 times, and we will see that in a certain number of cases she did the good thing, and in the other cases she did the bad thing. And that is all it means, for this to be indeterministic. So van Inwagen concludes this is a matter of chance. It's just a chance process with a certain probability playing out. So whether the agent does the good thing or the bad thing cannot be attributed to her. It's just that random process. There are various ways to react to that challenge. Most of you know Keynes' elaborate story of self-forming actions that try to get around this problem. But let's look at what the model says. First, I think in the long-term view, and I think this will be the easiest to agree with me, on a long-term reading, it's just wrong to say that attribution makes no sense, because we can train Alice, for example. So if Alice does the bad thing and we blame her, and this will influence her future decisions, then of course the attribution plays a sensible role in her development over time. This just means, this just is what it means for an agent to learn certain things, that through feedback on what the agent has done, there are changes in the way she will behave in the future. So the long-term challenge from luck, I think it can be dismissed. Also consider training, the parallel case to van Inwagen's free will challenge to van Inwagen's challenge to free will would be a case where, for example, I go to swimming training, and if I do a good breaststroke and my teacher tells me that was good and gives me positive feedback, then according to the van Inwagen argument, this couldn't be attributed to me because I might also have malfunctioned or done a bad breaststroke. But of course I could have. I'm not perfect as a swimmer. So we see that on the long time scale, attribution should be unproblematic. But what about the short time scale? And that, I think, is where the argument has some bite. So here is a very simple network of projective simulation where we have just one percept node, the initial situation, where the runs in the Alice scenario are started. And then Alice can do one of two things. So it can come out as agency 1, the good thing, or agency 2, the bad thing. And now let's assume that these probabilistic nodes, that these clips, C0, C1, C2, represent certain considerations, certain reasons for Alice to do certain things and not others. So C1 is, for example, just considering the goodness of the action that is in fact the good action. C1 may be considering the long-term consequences, and C2 concerning the short-term consequences. And then we can look at possible dynamics within this network, right? So it could be that, from the initial situation, Alice considers the moral goodness of the good thing and does the good thing. And we can understand that and attribute that. Or she could come to see the good thing, the goodness of the good action, but then consider long-term consequences and act on the long-term consequences. Or she can see the long-term consequences, but consider the short-term consequences and say, this is a situation I want to get out of. So why don't I do the bad thing? Or she may see the short-term consequences, but revert to considering the goodness of the action and do the good action anyway. So this is an argument that I've learned from Gerd Keil, but is apparently in Charlie Broad already. The actual course of deliberations of an agent under indeterminism will be different. It's not just a one-shot from the situation to the good or bad outcome, but it has a certain sequence of reasons that are considered by the agent. And so any one of these sequences of reasons makes sense. And that is how I think the luck objection can really be rejected, and the model gives you a precise reading of how this can be. So just to conclude, I've tried to suggest to you that we should approach agency from the perspective of agency attribution and read that realistically. We should take indeterminism seriously as a metaphysical possibility. We have the projective simulation model, and we can see that with this projective simulation model we can meet the challenge from luck both long-term through learning through feedback and short-term, as I've just told you. So thanks very much. So just
Thank you very much, Professor Müller. The response will be given by Professor Winfried Löffler from the University of Innsbruck.
Well, good evening. Here is a plan how I want to invest my 10 minutes. I want to say something in order to secure that I understood Thomas correctly. I will summarize how I read his paper. Secondly, I shall say what the model does achieve and what it doesn't achieve. And thirdly, and in partial defense of the model, I asked the question whether some form of the luck objection or the van Inwagen's replay objection returns in the model. But we shall see. It probably can be blocked. Okay. So here's a very short summary, I think, which is not really necessary, but briefly. Thomas talked about agency as a form of world involvement somewhere in between mere causation and morally relevant agency, or something like free will. In earlier papers, Briegel and Müller talked about libertarianism, and this is not anymore the terminology. Libertarianism would be slightly misleading here. We heard a vague explication what agency might come up to. It's a sort of intervention in the world out of own impulses, an output which is attributable to the agent, which is somehow learnable and trainable, flexible in short time perspective, adaptive in long time perspective, and it makes a difference to the agent as well, with reasons, interests, good, and so on. Agency is less than, is not connected with reflective self-consciousness, and it's especially nothing mysterious and nothing supernatural. That's clear. Now, we heard that Thomas believes that determinism is false, but false as it is, it would pose a threat also for agency. Because if there is only one possibility, there is no room for an intervention out of one's own impulse, which can be attributed to something or someone. But indeterminism, which is suggested by physics, also poses a threat to agency, because the base level randomness is not attributable to anyone, and so neither is agency. So we have a dilemma, and the exit from the dilemma is this general model how agency could exist under base level indeterminism. So how could it be that at the base level there is randomness and indeterminism? How could still be agency? And here comes this projective simulation model. I try to summarize it in my own words. So in the agent there is implemented a network of nodes with edges in between, with weighted edges between these nodes. These nodes here were called clips. Think of a clip as some memory content, which might be a visual sequence or a thought or a tune or a word or whatever. And there are probabilistic connections between these nodes. There comes an input from a perceptor node, and that starts an indeterministic activation hopping in this system between the nodes. And when the activation chains reach some actor node, this results in triggering an action. In the sketch that Thomas projected here, he had two edges starting from every node with an equal weight of 1/2 that could be different. Yeah? For simplicity, he just used 1/2 here. And if an action is successful, yeah, so to say, then that would raise the probability of the path which led to that action, and hence reinforces this path for the next round of the system. So this is the simplest way to describe this. Now, what does this model achieve, and what does it not achieve? I begin with the limits. So Müller and Briegel make no claim about realization of this model, whether this is implemented in some biological organism or so. This is not the question. They also make no claim how quantum mechanics exactly fits into that picture. Yeah? There is nothing said about, for instance, bridge principles between quantum mechanics and cell biology. So think of Roger Penrose's ideas with microtubuli and stuff like that. Nothing of all that shows up in Müller here. It's a mere model, yeah, a simplified model, how it could work. There are much more elaborate models, and models which also undergo experimental testing. See this paper by Hans Briegel and Gemma de las Cuevas from 2012. This is also available on the internet if your university pays to nature. I have the impression that the model is still within that scheme of an input and some sort of elaborate processing, and an output. So they do not talk about an agency entirely out of itself. So the beginning of the story is always an external stimulus. And I think, but this is maybe just a linguistic matter, in your paper I noticed a slight wavering between two forms of models. I mean, in the philosophy of science we talk about at least two basic forms of models. There are models which simplify the real thing and by leaving away many facets. For instance, light waves swing in all directions, but in physics textbooks we usually only take one direction of swinging. This is a simplifying model. Other types of models are simulating models. So if I study a realm A as if it were a realm B, which is easier to understand, this is a simulation model. And this is another type. I think that what you try here goes more into the direction of a simulating model, but at least at the linguistic level, I noticed a little wavering at some points. But this is peanuts. This is only linguistic. What does the model achieve? It shows that randomness at base level is compatible with a somewhat plastic non-randomness at agency level. So this is the main result. Why? Why can we attribute agency to an agent in that model? Because a specific reaction of this agent is attributable to this agent with its specific history of modifications of the weights in the system and so on. So it's something individual. It has to do with the history of this agent. We have seen that agency leads to changes in the agent itself by the shifts in the connection weights. And there is even a slight phenomenological similarity here. The activation hopping between the nodes in this memory. It has a slight similarity to what goes on in our mind when we are making a difficult decision. So we hop from one idea, from one motive, from one argument to the other without sometimes without clear motivations, and at some point we make the decision. Okay, I do A or I do non-A, and this indeterministic hopping in the system between the nodes has a slight similarity to that. But again, Briegel and Müller do not claim that this model is a description of what really goes on in our minds. Now, what about this replay objection? Let's summarize it again. Van Inwagen invites us to think of the action as repeated in a long sequence. At the first instant of this action, you might believe it's attributable to the agent. But if you think the action repeated 100 times, then this purported attributability of indeterministic agency vanishes. Because in the long run, you simply have a sequence of X% actions A and 1 minus X% actions non-A. And this again is a random sequence, and you could say this cannot be attributed to anyone. But Müller says, and rightly, it's not in a model. In the model, the action probabilities are indeed attributable to the agent with its specific history, its training, its shifts of weights in the network, etc. I think of this charming example with the swimming lesson. So my probability of making correct breaststrokes has to do with my efforts to learn that before. So it's not a mere random sequence anymore. So very sloppily spoken, what counts is not the thin time slice of the agent now, but what counts is the agent with his trajectory before. Now, last slide. There is a problem. One could formulate a very similar objection to van Inwagen's. Why? Because there is a lot given in advance in the model. The initial node structure as such, why is it just as it is? The initial weights in the system, you had 50-50, it could be different. The degrees of change in these weights, so what parameter is implemented here. So if you do a successful action, how strongly should your weights be changed? So all that is given in advance without comment. It may have whatever source. Now somebody could say, as the influence, as these factors influence the outcome, that means the action probabilities, these action probabilities and a fortiori the singular actions are likewise not attributable to anyone. And that means van Inwagen's objection seems to return here. Yeah, so there is a lot that influences the action. We don't know why. So is it still attributable to the agent? But, and here is my partial defense of the model, we should not be unfair. We judge in a very same style also when it goes for real agents. Yeah? When we are attributing agency to real agents, we usually also know only a relevant portion of the trajectory of these agents. Yeah, and that's the referent of our attribution. Yeah. We do not know the full prehistory of a cat or a person or whatever. And we need not know that in order to justly attribute the action to the agent. So we do not require to know the whole constitution history of an agent in order to attribute agency to it. So if this is okay for real agents, then it should also be okay for agents in your model. Thank you.
Professor Müller, would you like to respond briefly?
Very briefly. Yeah. Thanks, Winfried. I find myself fairly represented, I think. So it is true that these... I'll just show you the literature list. It is true that there are some phenomenological motivations for coming up with this model, really stumbling, from one consideration to another has this interesting phenomenology that we find represented in the model to some extent. Also, with respect to your observation, which is of course entirely correct, that we are still very much in a stimulus response scheme with respect to the to the model that I've shown to you. There are various complications of the model, various other versions of the model where we can have a more continuous stream of input and output as it is proper for us. For example, when I am doing something, I can be interrupted, I can be alerted to something and then do something else without the process first finishing. So that is certainly a trait of agency that we need to incorporate and that we're working on in building on this model. Thanks.